The chamber smelled of beeswax and old leather, the way places of official reckoning always did, as though the accumulated weight of other men's judgments had soaked itself permanently into the paneling. Dorothea Ashdown sat in the public gallery and looked down at her own face. She had not expected it to strike her so forcibly. She had known, from the moment Mrs. Cottle's note arrived at Cloverfield, crumpled and written in the housekeeper's careful hand, that Cecilia was doing this. She had known it on the carriage ride through the night, had turned it over and over in her mind, the way one prods a bruised place to map its edges. And still the sight of her sister seated at the petitioner's table below, in the good lavender-gray gown with the black trim, with Thea's own tortoiseshell combs pinned at the crown of her head, landed in Thea's chest like the flat of a hand. Cecilia was speaking. Thea could not quite hear the words from the gallery, but she could hear the shape of them. The careful modulation Cecilia had always been able to manage. The voice pitched 2 degrees lower than her natural register to achieve a quality of composed grief. She watched her sister's gloved hands lie open on the baize table, the gesture of a woman with nothing to hide, and felt the cold settle into her. At the raised dais, presiding over the tribunal in a coat so dark it absorbed the candlelight, Sir Clement Draycott had not moved in some time. She had heard his name spoken by the solicitors on her journey. She had not yet seen his face clearly from here, but she knew the quality of that stillness. Thea pulled her veil a fraction closer and fixed her eyes on the man who held Ashdown Park in his hands. She had been ill. That was the truth she had told herself. The truth she had lived inside for 3 months at Cloverfield. Her late husband's small property in Dorset, while the chancery matter of his estate ground through its appointed processes in London. She had been too unwell to travel. Cecilia had come to her in the 2nd month, solicitous, full of warm, competent arrangements, and had said that she would attend the preliminary hearings on Thea's behalf, that the solicitors had approved it, that it was a simple matter of establishing Thea's prior residence at Ashdown Park, and no final testimony would be required. Thea had believed her, because Cecilia had always been the one who managed things, who knew which letters to write and which calls to make, and because Thea had been tired in a way that went deeper than illness, a fatigue of the spirit that came from watching Edmund die slowly and carefully over 7 months, and then finding herself on the other side of that watching, in an empty house, with no useful purpose remaining. She had not, until Mrs. Cottle's note, understood what Cecilia was managing. The note was brief. "Come at once if you are able." I do not know how to say this any other way. The woman at the table is not you, but she knows your history, and I am afraid. Thea had dressed in her widow's black, pinned her bonnet, and climbed into the carriage before the Cloverfield household had woken fully. The roads from Dorset in October were not kind, and the journey had taken the better part of 2 days, the carriage jolting through the early dark, and then through a cold gray dawn, and then through the lengthening gray afternoon of a London that showed her its back streets and its bridges and its enormous impersonal sky, before depositing her in Chancery Lane, with her bones aching and her veil already pinned, and her heart conducting itself with a quietness she did not entirely trust. She had not been to London since Edmund's funeral in March. The city felt larger for the absence, or she felt smaller inside it, which was perhaps the same thing. She had stood on the pavement outside the tribunal building for 3 minutes before going in, watching the stream of solicitors and their clerks, and the occasional well-dressed petitioner pass through the stone archway, and she had thought, "My sister is in there wearing my name and speaking in my voice, and she has been doing it for weeks, and I was too tired and too trusting and too accustomed to letting her decide things to notice, until a housekeeper wrote me a frightened letter in the dark." She had gone in. Now she sat in the gallery of the Chancery Tribunal room with her veil down and her hands folded in her lap, and watched Cecilia perform her life with such fluency that the cold which had begun in Thea's chest had spread outward to her fingers. Beside her, not by accident, sat Mrs. Agnes Cottle. The housekeeper had not spoken since Thea sat down. She had taken Thea's gloved hand in both of hers and held it. And that was enough. Below, one of the solicitors at the adjacent table, a heavy man with a sheaf of papers and an air of procedural impatience, was addressing the tribunal. His voice carried better than Cecilia's to the gallery. "The widow of Sir Edmund Ashdown," he said, with the deliberate flatness of a man who had already formed his opinion, "has presented testimony consistent with continuous occupation of Ashdown Park from the date of marriage until Sir Edmund's death. My client, Captain Henry Ashdown, does not dispute the lady's occupation. He disputes the reading of the codicil." At the dais, Sir Clement made a note. He had been making notes with the same economy of motion for the entire hour Thea had been present. She watched him the way she had once watched the surgeon who attended Edmund, looking for the thing in the hands that would tell her what the face had already decided. His hands were precise. They moved to the paper and away again without excess. His face, what she could see of it from the gallery's angle, was the face of a man who had long ago discovered that expression was a liability in rooms like this one. She could not tell what he was thinking. She could only tell, when he lifted his eyes from the papers to the woman at the petitioner's table below, that he looked for a precise moment too long. If you have ever been uncertain whether you are being watched or whether you have only imagined it, stay with Thea for a moment. The uncertainty is not comfortable. It is sharp and deliberate, and it lives in the body, not the mind. Cecilia had found her rhythm. Thea could see it in the set of her shoulders, the half-turn toward the dais that managed to be both deferential and assured. She was answering a question now, something about the date of Sir Edmund's last amendment to his household accounts, and Thea watched her twin produce the correct information with a fluency that ought not to have been possible. Cecilia had done her research. Of course she had. Frederick Radlett's debts were not small, and Cecilia had always been thorough when the stakes were sufficient. The dismissive label arrived from the direction Thea least expected. Captain Henry's solicitor had returned to his papers, but he spoke now in an aside to his associate, not quite low enough. "A woman of no particular discernment," he said, and the contempt in the phrase was not directed at Cecilia. It was the contempt for Thea herself, the absent widow, the woman who had delegated her own legal hearing to a sister because she could not manage the carriage ride. We may proceed on the assumption that the widow has authorized whatever arrangement she has sent her representative to confirm. Mrs. Cottle's grip tightened almost imperceptibly on Thea's hand. At the dais, Sir Clement had gone still in a new way, not the stillness of procedure. Something else. He was looking at the tortoiseshell combs in Cecilia's hair. He had not wanted this appointment. He had told the Lord Chancellor so plainly, and without the diplomatic softening that the conversation perhaps required, because Edmund Ashdown had been his closest friend for 20 years, and a man did not sit in judgment of his dead friend's estate without the question of his own feelings becoming a procedural complication. The Lord Chancellor had told him, with the mild patience of a man who has heard every objection worth hearing, that his precision was exactly what the case required, that there were questions of fraud which only a man of Clement's rigor could properly uncover, and that his personal connection to Sir Edmund was an asset rather than a liability, because it meant he would not be managed by either party's solicitors. Clement had accepted the appointment and had found, in the weeks since, that the Lord Chancellor had not been wrong. The case smelled wrong. The woman at the petitioner's table gave correct answers in the wrong register, as though she had memorized the score, but had never heard the music played. Small things. The way she referred to the east wing of Ashdown Park as the family rooms, when Edmund had always called them the old rooms, a distinction that seemed minor and was not. The way she named the household dogs with a half-second hesitation that could be attributed to grief, but sat uneasily with the fluency of everything else she said. The way she held her hands at rest, palms open on the table, which was the gesture of a woman presenting herself as transparent, and which was very slightly too deliberate to be unstudied. Clement had made notes of these things. He had not acted on them because procedural rigor required evidence rather than impression, and because his own history with the Ashdown family made him appropriately suspicious of his own instincts. He had attended Edmund's wedding. It had been a small and very quiet affair at St. George's, Hanover Square, in the autumn of 1812. He had watched Edmund place a pair of small tortoiseshell hair combs into Dorothea Vine's hands in the vestry, a private moment that had somehow included Clement and the vicar, and nobody else, because Edmund had wanted a witness. The combs had been his mother's, he had said. Thea had held them for a moment as though they had weight beyond their size, and then she had pressed them to her mouth and said nothing, which had moved Clement more than any declaration would have. The combs in the woman's hair below had a tortoiseshell finish and a particular curve that he had last seen in a vestry in 1812. He looked at the woman at the petitioner's table for a long, careful, absolutely still moment. Then he looked up at the public gallery. The Tribunal Room's gallery was sparsely populated, a quality of London hearings in the early afternoon when the novelty had worn thin. An elderly gentleman with a cough, two young men who appeared to be clerks making notes of their own, a woman in full mourning black, her face entirely veiled. The veiled woman was sitting beside the Ashdown housekeeper. Clement returned his eyes to his papers and made a note that had nothing to do with the testimony. Dorothea. The name had arrived in his mind with a certainty that his procedural training did not permit him to act on, and his entire being had already committed to, regardless. He had known her slightly, through Edmund, across 12 years of occasional dinners, and one summer at Ashdown Park when Edmund's gout had confined him to the library, and Thea had walked the grounds with the dogs, and Clement had gone with her because there was nothing else to do. And he had found, over the course of those walks, that she was the most quietly exact person he had ever spent time with. She said what she meant. She did not perform for him. She asked questions that were precise and genuine. And when he answered, she listened in a way that felt to a man whose professional life was spent with people managing him, like the absence of a pressure he had not previously noticed. His wife Helena had died in October of 1812. He had told himself, in the years since, that he did not deserve the kind of attention that felt like relief. He had not spoken to Dorothea Ashdown beyond formal condolences since Edmund's death. He had spent the last 3 weeks watching a woman who was not her Guyve testimony at his tribunal, and growing steadily more certain that he was right. The afternoon light shifted through the high chancery windows. The tribunal was approaching its final session. Clement looked up at the gallery once more, and this time the veiled woman had turned her face slightly, as though she had felt his attention. And the angle of her shoulders carried something he recognized from those walks along the Ashdown grounds 12 years ago. The posture of a woman deciding whether to act. He could not, in his judicial capacity, invite testimony from a gallery observer without cause. He could not halt the proceedings without evidence. What he could do, and what he was already doing, was slow his own notes to the deliberate pace of a man finding his way carefully through a difficult question, buying the minutes that the gallery might need. Captain Henry Ashdown's solicitor had returned to his prepared summary. His colleague murmured the dismissive phrase again, more quietly this time, clearly intending it for the associate only. But the room's acoustics carried it with a clarity the man had not anticipated. "A woman of no particular discernment," he said under his breath, speaking now of the widow directly, the absent Thea. "Would not notice if the estate managed itself." Cecilia did not flinch. She had anticipated it, or she had chosen not to hear it. She turned a degree toward the dais and said, with the composed authority of a woman who has rehearsed this moment, that she wished to submit the final household records as evidence of continuous occupation. The papers slid across the baize. Clement received them without looking up. In the gallery, Thea stood. She had not decided to stand, in the sense that she had formed the intention and then executed it. It was more that her body had arrived at the decision before her mind had finished the argument, and she found herself on her feet with the railing of the gallery balustrade under her gloved hands, and the whole formal chamber laid out below her like a map of everything Cecilia had built in her absence. The gallery railing was cold through her gloves. Below her, the green baize table held the papers Cecilia had just surrendered. The room smelled still of beeswax and old leather, but Thea also smelled, faintly, the cold air that clung to her own coat from the journey. 2 days of October roads still embedded in the wool. She had not had time to change. She had come directly from the carriage to this gallery, still road-dusty, still aching, still in the dress she had put on in a dark house in Dorset before dawn. There was something clarifying about that, or at least she decided to find it clarifying. Cecilia, below, was dressed for this occasion. She had prepared for it. She had spent weeks preparing for it. Thea had spent 48 hours in a carriage in morning black, arriving barely in time, and she was standing at the railing with her veil down and her hands cold, and her mind arrived, finally and without ambiguity, at the single thing it had been moving toward since Mrs. Cottle's letter came. Mrs. Cottle rose beside her and did not speak. Below, Cecilia felt it. Thea saw the exact moment it happened, the slight change in her twin's shoulders, the half-second of arrested motion. Cecilia turned and looked up at the gallery. Their eyes met across 15 feet of formal chancery air. Cecilia's face did not change. She was too controlled for that, too experienced with managing the surface of things, but something in her eyes said, with absolute clarity, what her expression refused to say. "Sit down. You will ruin everything. I am doing this for us, for the family, for the estate that Edmund's wastrel brother will sell for parts the moment the codicil is confirmed. Sit down, Thea. You were always the one who let me decide." Thea reached up and took hold of the edge of her veil. She had been, all her life, the quieter twin, the one who read where Cecilia acted, who thought where Cecilia spoke, who stood at the edge of rooms where Cecilia stood at their center. She had not resented it. It was simply the way of them, the grammar of how they had been together since girlhood, the pattern so deeply set that neither of them had examined whether it was chosen or inherited, or simply convenient to the one of them it suited most. Edmund had seen something else. He had told her so once on a December evening in the Ashdown library when the fire was low and she had been doing nothing more particular than reading at the other end of the room. He had said, without looking up from his own book, that she was the most clear-sighted person he had ever loved, and that he hoped she knew it. She had not answered him because she had not known, in that moment, how to receive it. She knew now. She lifted the veil. At the tribunal dais, Sir Clement had already set down his pen. He said, in the measured register he used for procedural statements, with the same weight and economy he brought to everything that mattered, I would ask that proceedings pause. The room obliged him. Rooms of this kind always did. He looked at the gallery. He said, and the words fell into the chamber's silence with the deliberate precision of a man who has already decided and is now simply stating the record. The widow of Sir Edmund Ashdown has not yet spoken. 11 words. Below, Cecilia's composure fractured with the specific quality of a thing that has been holding itself together too long. It did not collapse dramatically. It simply ceased, the way a performance ceases when the audience's presence is no longer assumed. The room turned to the gallery. Thea descended the narrow stair at the gallery's edge with Mrs. Cottle behind her and walked through the low door that admitted the public to the floor of the chamber. The solicitors on both sides had gone very still. Captain Henry, seated at the far table, had half risen from his chair with an expression Thea did not have time to fully read. She came forward to the open space before the dais and looked up at him. He looked back at her. There was a moment that the room contained without quite understanding. She watched him see her. Not the fact of her, but the particular quality of her. The width of her gray eyes and the small scar at her right temple, and the way her hands were folded at her waist. The same hands that had walked the Ashdown grounds in 1814 and asked him precise questions that he had answered precisely and had not forgotten. "Mrs. Ashdown," he said. His voice was level. "Sir Clement," she said. Hers was not quite. He addressed the chamber. He said that in light of new information, he was suspending the formal session and requesting that both parties remain present, that the individual currently seated at the petitioner's table provide documentation of her identity, and that the Ashdown housekeeper, Mrs. Agnes Cottle, present herself as a witness. He said all of this in the measured cadence of a man who had already conducted this scene in his head and was now simply walking through its necessary steps. Mrs. Cottle came forward and identified herself. She identified Thea. She stated, in the careful plain sentences of a woman who has been waiting 3 weeks to say this to the right person, that the woman at the petitioner's table was not the widow of Sir Edmund Ashdown, but was Mrs. Cecilia Radlett, the deceased sister-in-law, and that the widow herself was present and standing before the tribunal. She produced, from her reticule, a small miniature. Edmund had commissioned it in the first year of their marriage. It showed Thea in profile, the gray eyes and the scar at the right temple both clearly visible, and it had lived on Mrs. Cottle's mantelpiece in the Ashdown Park housekeeper's room since the day Edmund had given the housekeeper a copy as a gesture of fondness. Clement looked at the miniature. He looked at Thea. He reached across the dais and turned to the documentation of occupation that Cecilia had submitted, running one finger down the page to the descriptions of the petitioner's appearance submitted in the first session, and read aloud the notation regarding hair ornamentation, specifically the tortoiseshell hair combs described as the petitioner's personal possession. He looked at Cecilia. He said, "I wonder if you would remove the combs." Cecilia said nothing. Her hands came to her hair slowly, reluctantly, as though each motion cost her something she could not replace. The combs came free. She set them on the baize table. "Mrs. Ashdown," Clement said, "were these your property?" "They were my husband's mother's," Thea said. "He gave them to me on our wedding day. Sir Clement was present." The room absorbed this. Even Captain Henry's solicitor, who had not ceased being procedurally impatient, had the decency to look as though he was reconsidering his earlier statements about women of no particular discernment. What followed was not theatrical. This was not a scene of collapse and recrimination and public humiliation. Clement was too precise for that. And Thea, watching him conduct the next 40 minutes of formal inquiry, understood that his precision was a form of mercy as well as rigor. He questioned Cecilia directly, calmly, without contempt, exposing the impersonation through a sequence of questions about Ashdown Park that any wife of 8 years would have answered without effort, and that Cecilia, with her research and her preparation, was simply unable to sustain beyond the third or fourth specific. The name of the head groom. The number of the steps in the servants' stair. What Edmund called the old rooms. Small things. The kind of small things that accrue in a life lived rather than a life studied from the outside. Cecilia's answers grew shorter. Then they stopped. Frederick Radlett, who had been present in the corridor and was admitted when Clement requested it, spent 4 minutes in the chamber before announcing, with the performance of a man who has decided that the ship is sinking and that he had always meant to swim, that he had advised his wife against this course of action and had been overruled. Nobody believed him. Nobody needed to. The Lord Chancellor's observer, Lord Pensby, who had been present throughout in the corner of the chamber, with the stillness of a man whose job is to see without being seen, came forward during the recess and confirmed that the matter would require formal review, but that in his opinion the new testimony was unimpeachable. He said it looking at Clement, and Clement received the statement without expression. Captain Henry crossed the room to Thea and said quietly that he was glad she had come, and that he hoped they might discuss the estate as family rather than as opposing parties, and that Edmund had always spoken well of her. She thanked him. She meant it. It was nearly 5 in the afternoon when the chamber emptied. The solicitors gathered their papers. Mrs. Cottle had gone to arrange a hackney. Lord Pensby had departed with his observer and his impenetrable calm. The lamps were being trimmed by a clerk who moved around the room without particular interest in the remaining 2 people. Thea was standing near the petitioner's table, pulling on her gloves, when she heard Clement's footsteps cross the chamber behind her. She turned. He had removed his formal coat and was carrying it over one arm, which made him look less like a judicial authority and more like a man who had spent a very long day doing something he had found both necessary and costly. He stopped a proper distance from her. The lamplight caught the silver at his temples and the precise set of his jaw and the quality of his eyes, which were pale gray with dark rims, and which were looking at her with an attention that did not manage to be procedural regardless of his obvious wish that it could be. "Dorothea," he said. The word landed as though it had been waiting a very long time to be spoken. She felt the heat rise in her face. She did not permit herself to look away from him, because she was not, whatever the solicitor's contemptible aside had presumed, a woman of no particular discernment. She was a woman who had just sat in a public gallery and watched her own twin testify in her name, and had then stood up and removed her veil, and she was not about to be undone now by a man saying her name in a quiet room. Or she was not entirely undone. There was a difference. "Sir Clement," she said. "Clement," he said. "Edmund called me Clement. I would prefer it." She looked at him. The clerk moved around the far end of the room, oblivious. Somewhere outside the high windows, London was doing the things London always did in the early evening, the carriages and the calls and the enormous indifferent machinery of the city proceeding without reference to what had happened in this chamber. "How long had you known," she said, "that the woman was not you?" He considered the question with the same seriousness he seemed to bring to every question. "Since the 3rd session. I knew your husband for 20 years. I attended your wedding. The knowledge of a person is not always articulable, but it exists. You could not say so without evidence." "No." "The Combs?" she said. "Yes." He had taken 3 steps toward her during this exchange, without appearing to have decided to do so, the way the body moves when the mind has not yet caught up with it. And they were now standing closer than the situation required. and further apart than either of them, perhaps. Wanted. She was acutely aware of his hands, and the fact that one of them was very slightly open at his side, a stillness that was not natural stillness, but arrested motion. She said, "Edmund was fortunate in his friends." "Edmund?" Clement said, and stopped. He looked at the floor for a moment, the expression of a man making a decision he cannot unmake. "Edmund told me in the last month that I had been keeping myself at a suitable distance from the world for long enough. He said that Helena would have found it both unnecessary and irritating." Thea said nothing. She was listening in the way she listened, fully and without management, and she was aware that her own breath had gone quiet, in a way that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. "He was not wrong," Clement said. The lamplight lay between them. The clerk had gone. The chamber had acquired the particular quality of a room in which two people are alone and have noticed it. He said, "You have had a long and difficult day, and I have no right to detain you further. I would, with your permission, call tomorrow." Thea looked at him. She looked at the precise angular line of his face, and the exhaustion behind his eyes, and the care with which he was managing his own voice, a management she recognized because she had been practicing it herself for 3 months, in an empty house in Dorset. "You may call tomorrow," she said. "Come in the morning." He inclined his head. It was a small motion, but something in it was not small at all. She put her hand out for the tortoise-shell combs, which were still on the baize table beside her. He picked them up and placed them in her palm, and his fingers brushed the back of her glove. And neither of them said anything about it, because there was nothing adequate to say. She walked out of the chamber. He stood in the empty room and looked at the door for rather longer than the situation required. By the following spring, the Combs lived on the dressing table of the East Wing at Ashdown Park, which Clement had taken to calling the old rooms because Edmund had, and which Thea had taken to sharing with a man whose hands were precise and kind, and who had learned, slowly and with some difficulty, that being wrong once and paying for it was not the same as being wrong forever. Clement had called the morning after the tribunal, as she had invited him, and they had talked for 2 hours about Edmund, and about Helena, and about the estate, and about the particular quality of London in November, when the fog came off the Thames and turned the streets into something that required a good reason to be outside. He had come again 3 days later, without particular reason. She had not asked him to explain it. She was not, as had been established, a woman of no particular discernment. The formal proceedings concluded in January. Captain Henry received his interest in the estate as the codicil specified, a fair portion that he intended to invest in a property of his own in Hertfordshire. Thea retained the life tenancy at Ashdown Park, as Edmund's will had always intended. Mrs. Cottle received a written apology from the lead solicitor, who had not known what his associate was saying in those aside-voiced assessments of the absent widow's acuity. The apology was brief and formal, and Mrs. Cottle received it with the dignity of a woman who knew its value and did not require it to be more than it was. Cecilia and her husband removed to his smaller property in Kent. Cecilia had not spoken to Thea, not directly, not in the days that followed the tribunal when the legal process required their physical proximity. She had looked at Thea once, in the corridor outside the chambers on the day of the formal finding, with an expression that was not quite remorse and not quite defiance, and that Thea, who knew her sister's face the way one knows one's own, understood to be something closer to a grief that had not yet decided what shape it would take. Thea had looked back at her and had not said anything, because there was no sentence adequate to this, and she had never been the one who spoke when the silence contained more truth. By March, A letter came. Thea did not open it immediately. She held it for a morning, and then she opened it in the library at Ashdown Park with the early spring light coming through the tall windows, and Cecilia had written 4 paragraphs of sentences that were not quite an apology and not quite an explanation, and that Thea read twice and then set down in her lap and looked out at the grounds for a long time. She wrote back a single page. She did not know yet what they could be to each other now. She did not say that they could never be anything. She said that she was at Ashdown Park and that the gardens were beginning again and that the door was not closed. It was Clement who found her sitting with the letter still in her hands on a Tuesday afternoon in March when he had come without announcement, as he had developed a habit of doing, because she had told him 3 months prior that she found the formal call too managed and would prefer him simply to arrive. He stood in the library doorway and looked at her for a moment, and she looked at him, and he came across the room and sat in the chair nearest hers without saying anything, which was the right thing. After a time she said, "My sister wrote." He said, "I know. Mrs. Cottle told me." "You were supposed to look surprised," she said. He considered this with the expression that she had learned meant he was deciding whether to be wry about something, a decision that, when it went in the wry direction, produced the particular brief shift in his face that she had come to wait for. "I did not think the news warranted performance," he said. She set the letter down on the small table between them. He did not reach for it. He waited. She wrote that she had done it for Edmund's memory. Thea said that she could not bear to see the estate go to a man who had not known Edmund as she had. "She had known Edmund for 8 years, Clement said, levelly. She had. Thea looked at her hands. She is not, I think, entirely wrong that she loved him. In her way. The Radlett finances were the larger part of it. Both things can be true." "They can," Clement said. He said it as a man who had spent his working life understanding that 2 things can be true, and it did not sound like agreement. It sounded like something harder and more useful. She looked at him across the afternoon light. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her in the tribunal chamber after the room had emptied, with an attention that did not know how to be procedural and had stopped trying. He had called it an attention. She had called it something else in her own mind, alone in the mornings before he arrived, when she sat with her tea and allowed herself to think about what it was she was looking forward to. He had said, on the evening in February, when he had finally said the thing he had been not quite saying for 3 months, that he had been keeping his distance from the world for long enough, that Edmund had been right, and that he found himself unwilling to continue the practice. He had said it with his hands folded on the library table, and his eyes on the wall. The posture of a man delivering a legal argument he is uncertain will be well received, she had said, because she was not a woman who had learned to perform for an audience of 1. That she had been sitting in this library every morning for 3 months, hoping he would arrive. He had looked at her then. The expression on his face had been the expression of a man who had been keeping a great deal of himself very tightly managed, and who had just received permission to stop. He had reached across the table, slowly, with the deliberateness of a man who does not act without understanding what he is doing, and covered her hand with his. That was all. It was enough. Spring was advancing outside the old rooms. The dogs that Edmund had named and that Thea had continued to care for were somewhere in the grounds in the afternoon warmth, audible occasionally as a distant barking, happy in the way of creatures who do not require their circumstances to be other than they are. Mrs. Cottle had given instructions to the kitchen. Lord Pensby had sent a note of congratulation regarding the estate settlement, that was brief and warm and characteristic of a man who preferred observation to ceremony. Clement was looking at the tortoiseshell combs on Thea's dressing table from where he sat. Because the library door stood open and he could see the room beyond, and the combs caught the afternoon light on their curve, the way they had caught it in the tribunal chamber. The way they had caught it in a vestry in 1812, when Edmund had pressed them into a woman's hands and said quietly, "I wanted a witness." Clement had been the witness then. He looked at Thea now, at the gray eyes and the small scar at her right temple, and the precise stillness of her hands in her lap. A stillness that he knew by now contained rather more than it displayed. And he thought, "I am still witnessing." She reached for the letter. She folded it carefully and set it in the small drawer of the side table, the drawer where she kept the things that required time rather than resolution. She looked at him. She said, "Stay for supper." He said, "I had already assumed I would." She did not smile. Quite. He did not smile, quite. Between them, the afternoon light held steady in the old rooms of Ashdown Park, the house that Edmund had loved and that Thea had made livable, and that was, now, beginning to feel like a home that two people were building rather than one person inhabiting. The Combs sat on the dressing table where they had always belonged. The dogs found their way back through the garden door. The fire Mrs. Cottle had laid in the library grate took hold and began to make the particular sound of a fire that will last the evening. The old rooms, Edmund had called them, meaning the east wing, where the light came in late, and gold through windows that needed new frames, and where the floorboards spoke under any step heavier than a cat's. Thea had been repairing them, slowly, since January. She had replaced the curtains in the sitting room with fabric in a deep green that the afternoon light turned almost warm. She had had the piano tuned, which had been waiting since before Edmund's illness, and Clement had sat in the chair by the window last week and listened to her play a passage from Clementi, and had said, when she finished, that Edmund had mentioned she played well, and that Edmund had understated it. She had not said anything in reply. She had played the passage again. It was enough. It was more than enough. If Thea's story has stayed with you, leave a word below. Every story here is built for listeners who know that quiet dignity is worth witnessing.